This video is about Empire of Ash, the upcoming Doom of Valyria prequel TV series to Game of Thrones. It's the third of 3 faction profiles I'm making, and this one is on the faction known as the Freeholders. The Freeholders are rich merchant princes, bankers and magisters, the local elites, below the Dragonlords, but above the slaves. They're not Dragonlords, they don't have dragons, but that isn't their strategy. Their strength is money, they're the richest faction, so it's money as power. And they're not so much one unified faction as an alliance of various sub-factions that came together in common cause, merchants from all over the Valyrian Freehold. As a result of that, the subgroups are very diverse and interesting, and over half of them aren't white. The Freeholders' strongest power base, geographically, is the Valyrian province in Sothorios, Fantasy Africa. It's analogous to Roman North Africa, this province in revolt against the capital region. The POV character for the Freeholders is a matronly Asian woman in her 50s, a former slave herself, taken from Yiti, their version of China. She worked her way up from nothing to become the richest single person in the Valyrian Freehold, so now she's a major political player and influencer, and one of the leading freeholders. So that's the quick overview of everything I'm going to talk about. As I said, I made 3 faction profiles. The first 2 are on the Young Dragons and on the Sphinxes. I made more videos than that because when I made the Sphinxes video, it was nearly 2 hours long. So I split it up into 3 shorter videos based on its internal chapters. So conceptually, it's one big video, but they were clear stopping points, so I busted it up along those lines. And that worked out pretty well. So I've decided to repeat that here for the Freeholders, that this is conceptually one big video, but it's split into 3 parts based on those 3 slides I just showed you. That the first one, the one you're watching now, is going to be a faction overview in general about their origins as a faction, their place in Valyrian society. Then part 2 is going to be geographically Sothorios and why a lot of their forces are there and the economic forces that are going on. And then part 3 will be focusing on their POV character. It's sort of like what I did with the Sphinxes. So if you watch the other 2 first, which you should have, it's going to follow that similar format. So this is one conceptually big video that I've split up into smaller parts. Introductions out of the way. As I said in the other videos, the idea behind these faction profiles is I made that big leak about Empire of Ash to Game of Thrones Wiki first week of July, and I'm torn between, well, I want to keep promoting this show, otherwise they won't make it, versus I don't want to give too many more spoilers. So what I'm doing is I keep referring back to that original leak post, citing stuff I already said in public, or a lot of it's just clarifying with context, things we already knew from the books about Valyria in case you haven't read them already, or stuff from Roman history which you can kind of tell what they're trying to go for. So I did that in the other videos, same format here, I'm citing things to explain the context, and this really helps because I want to include people who haven't read it already. I'm going to begin with a brief recap of world history. I went through this more slowly in the Sphinxes video. World map here. There's Westeros on the left, Free Cities on the right. There's Valyria in the middle on that big peninsula. Here's a simplified map to make it easier to see, that there's the Free Cities, Slaver's Bay, and Valyria in the middle. What happened was, the Valyrians were originally a humble race of shepherds, but they discovered and tamed dragons nesting in the volcanoes near their homeland, and they used them to conquer the Giscari Empire to their east in a series of 5 major wars that raged 6,000 to 5,000 years ago. That's where Meereen is, and the Giscari Empire had vast legions, but they couldn't stand up to dragons, so they were defeated and their people dragged off into slavery. Then about 1,000 years ago, the Valyrians turned their attention west and went to war with the Rhoynar people in the region of the modern Free Cities. And they fought bravely and used magic to try to stop them, but they just couldn't stand up to that many dragons, and they too were eventually defeated. Now, the Free Cities were not Rhoynar cities they conquered, the way Meereen is a Giscari city that was conquered. The Free Cities are Valyrian colonies that were planted in the west in opposition and rivalry to the Rhoynar, and they grew and prospered. The most important one you hear of is probably Volantis. That was the first and greatest of the Free Cities, with its gigantic long bridge across the Rhoyne River. And from the TV series, you'd probably also recognize Pentos on the west coast, on the Narrow Sea, where the Targaryens were at the beginning of the story in the first episode. So when the dust settled, about 600 years or so before the Doom happened 400 years ago, the Valyrians ruled an empire stretching from Pentos in the west to Meereen in the east and beyond. Then, for 6 centuries, the Valyrians reigned as masters of half of the known world. They'd extended to their geographic boundaries. Anyone else was either too far away or too poor to be worth conquering. And their civilization flourished. Now, in the books it says, Valyria at the zenith of its power was neither a kingdom nor an empire, or at least it had neither a king nor an emperor. It was more akin to the old Roman Republic. In theory, the franchise, that is, voting rights, included all freeholders, that is, free-born landowners. Of course, in practice, wealthy, highborn, and sorcerously powerful families came to dominate. There was about 40 families of Dragonlords actually dominated politics. And in Empire of Ash, we learned that they were divided into 2 major factions of Dragonlords, the Sphinxes and the Young Dragons. And summing up the other videos, the Sphinxes descend from the original Valyrian aristocracy, the original nobles and priests when they were humble shepherds, who somehow learned to tame dragons, blue blood nobility. The Young Dragons are the younger aristocracy. They descend from common soldiers who became powerful warlords during Valyria's wars of conquest, growing rich from plunder and slaves. The term is novus homo from Roman, that these are new men, nouveau riche. The Freeholders, as I said before, are rich merchant princes, bankers and magisters. Well, they have a variety of origins. Some of them are just local elites, local governors, but generally the unifying theme is 2 things. That they're below the Dragonlords, so they're being excluded from politics, and they're wealthy from trade. Money as power. And because they're from all over the Freehold, they're very diverse, including racially. I'll talk about this more in another video, but like medieval people, the Romans, which the Valyrians are based on, had a different concept of race than we do. That they didn't think of it in terms of white and black. That wasn't a concept to them. So the Romans practiced race-blind slavery. Like, they enslaved people in France, and there were local governors that they co-opted in Roman North Africa or Syria who were black or Semitic. So you could have a black provincial governor in Egypt or Syria owning white slaves taken from Greece and France, and vice versa. That it wasn't our concept of race. It was this cultural and ethnic melting pot. I mean, you've seen other shows based on ancient Rome, like HBO's Rome and the Spartacus things. So they didn't think of it as white and black. They thought of it as Valyrians and everyone else. We're Valyria. We're not like people from the Andals and the First Men of Westeros any more than we are some other group. So it's just the Valyrian Dragonlords and everyone else. They don't see it in terms of black and white races. Their concept of that is very different from ours. So, like ancient Rome, we'll see that in Valyria, that they practice race-blind slavery, that there are regional governors and merchant princes and power brokers who are black or Asian or whatever. So, where did these freeholders come from, and why are they powerful now? Well, for many centuries, it was just the Sphinxes versus their rivals, the Young Dragons, nipping at their heels trying to get power, that they're the youngest faction. Well, after all the major wars of conquest ended, after the Rhoynar Wars, in the centuries of peace under the Dragonlords, wealth stopped being generated so much by conquests. There weren't major new conquests anymore, so much as by commerce. This isn't one thing, it's just there was peace and prosperity, and some people gained more. So merchants, more than soldiers, flourished, building a continent-spanning trade network. And in time, they even started more complex innovations in high finance, with the first true banks and merchant guilds. These were probably the first large-scale banks in their world. They hadn't had an empire of this scale before. The Valyrian Dragonlords, however, were, well, I'll summarize it as they were very old-school aristocrats, pretty much similar to what we already saw with feudal lords in Westeros, that they were fixated on gaining money in one of two ways. One, plunder from conquests, or two, wealth directly generated from the lands you control. That you make olive oil, you sell it, or you tax the farmers on your land. That's what they conceived of as making money. So the idea of lending out money at interest to shipping concerns, this hadn't really come around before. So they couldn't grasp it, and they avoided it. So they were not involved in this great outpouring and then concentration of wealth in all these centuries of peace. So the Dragonlords didn't really get involved in this rise of banking and money lending at interest and investment banks. They thought they were above it, and it was really an alien concept, so they missed out on that this could be a route to power, and they underestimated the rise of the Freeholders over the centuries. That the Dragonlords would be asking the Freeholders, well, we're confused. What exactly does your investment bank make? And the Freeholders would go, well, we make money. Well, yes, it makes money, but what does your bank create? Well, we create wealth, and so on. It's really like in Westeros in the novels, the situation with Littlefinger, that Tyrion points out everyone underestimates him because they're this old aristocracy so mired in that old mindset of power comes from owning a big castle, owning a lot of land that you have landed knights planted on, or you get a political marriage. This whole idea that Littlefinger owns this tiny little one-tower keep in the middle of nowhere, too small to name. He's barely above a hedge knight. But Tyrion understands, in this big quote from A Clash of Kings, that he is one of the richest men in the kingdoms as the treasurer, that he doesn't just tax, he takes the tax money and lends it out at interest to dyers' guilds and cloth guilds and vertical integration, and he's speculating in business to make exponentially more money. But no one really notices because they're this old landed aristocracy, warrior aristocracy of knights and lords, that they really don't pause to consider that he's getting this much wealth and power. Wealth is a path to power. That Tyrion sums up their attitude as just, why would anyone fear him? He's a man of undistinguished birth. He has no banners to call. He has no knights at his direct command, no army, no holdings, and no prospects of a great marriage. And that's pretty much how the Dragonlords saw the Freeholders for many centuries, which was short-sighted. Now, the Valyrian Freehold was supposed to be a republic, a democracy with widespread voting rights, for anyone who owned land, which is what the United States Constitution originally gave rights to any man who owned land. So this is far more democratic than Westeros. It's a republic. And they promised these voting rights, but as Martin's quote said, in practice, it's become dominated by two self-interested factions of Dragonlords, these entrenched establishment politicians. One that's in power, the other one who's out of power but fighting for them. But the one out of power, the young dragons, they're fighting for themselves. They care nothing about the people. It's just these two factions that everyone says they're the same. They're just these establishment politicians. on a functional level, everyone below the Dragonlords doesn't really have full citizenship or voting rights, that they've become functionally disenfranchised from this corrupt system. So the great irony is that as the centuries passed, this rising middle class of merchants grew increasingly rich, even while their political rights steadily decreased. That now they're completely cut out of the political system, and they're more wealthy than both factions of Dragonlords put together. So eventually things reached a point where the traders, bankers, and local elites looked around and had to ask, what have the Valyrians ever done for us? Why are we still paying them taxes? We're not represented. Which of course leads into, this is again exactly what happened to the Roman Republic. That I explained in the Sphinx's video, just as there was a split between the upper and lower aristocracy, the optimates and populares, Marius and Sulla, there started to be pop-up rebellions all over the place in the last century BC by local elites who felt that the Senate has become so corrupt and no one is looking out for us, or why don't we have voting rights the way ethnic Romans do? So they're basing this on real life, pulled from history. Specifically, this actually did happen to Marius and Sulla in their lifetimes. Everyone thinks of, oh, how Caesar ended the Republic. That was the second generation of this. He died in the 40s BC. This is the 80s and 90s BC, 40 years before that. During the time of Marius and Sulla, look this up, I'm going to link it in the video description, the Social War of 91 to 88 BC. And this happened concurrently with the fighting between the upper and lower aristocracy factions in Rome. That provincial leaders grew upset that they were politically and economically dominated by Rome, with no real representation in the Senate, so they rebelled. And it became this three-way fight that Marius and Sulla had to fight them at first, and then, well, it turned into a three-way fight later, that then they started fighting each other while they were fighting these pop-up rebellions. So, I wasn't told this comparison, but I know Roman history. I really think they were basing this also on another figure from the same time period, Jugurtha, king of Numidia. Numidia is a North African kingdom just west of Carthage. And this involved Marius and Sulla, but it was a bit before that, about 20 years before that, the beginning of their careers. And Numidia wasn't part of Rome, but it was a client kingdom, a dependent ally. The same thing that people on the fringes were starting to rebel against them and their hegemony. Jugurtha was the king of Numidia, and he got the throne by usurping it ahead of his cousins, who were Roman allies, which led to war. And this is an infamous event, and it really signaled the decline of the Roman Republic in terms of their morals, that Jugurtha realized that he didn't need to defeat the invincible Roman armies, the invincible Roman legions that defeated Hannibal, on the battlefield. He just had to bribe off their corrupt generals and politicians to go away. So Rome kept sending envoy after envoy, sometimes even armies and generals, and then they just come back to Rome and go, well, Jugurtha's a great guy, pay no attention to those money bags in my supply train that he gave me. And it was just how everyone lost their sense of patriotism, that just you can buy off public leaders like that these Roman diplomats and generals would just, that susceptible to bribery. Jugurtha even infamously said Rome would sell the city itself if they could only find a buyer who could pay enough. That it's just a matter of how much, not that we wouldn't, of how corrupt they were. And eventually Sulla and Marius came around, who couldn't be bought. But even then, he realized, well, I don't need to defeat them on the battlefield. I can just run circles around them with Fabian strategy, that is, hit-and-run attacks, what the Dornish did to the Targaryens in Westeros, that if a dragon comes, don't be stupid enough to fight it, run away, and harass their supply line. Jugurtha had a lot of light cavalry, so he'd just run away from the Roman legions, circle around, destroy their supply line, and then fade back into the desert. So he held off the Roman legions for 6 years. That's a long time that this was a total embarrassment. And Sallust wrote this great history on it, a history of the Jugurthine War. All this I'm going to link in the video description here. So I think this strongly influenced what they did, that this was in the time of Marius and Sulla. It was the same people were doing this, and just what if Jugurtha was a little more aligned with the pop-up rebellions in Italy itself of local elites, and okay, he's technically a client kingdom, but let's say he was allied with them. And particularly because they said the freeholders are based in what's their version of Roman North Africa, and Jugurtha was a local king in North Africa. So it lines up perfectly. So on my chart, when I go, the Sphinxes are like the Optimates, and the Young Dragons are like the Populares. The Freeholders are like a combination of the Social War cities and Jugurtha, is just my shorthand way of saying this. And I point out to the source, and I was just going, let me guess, they're like Jugurtha. Also a mix of another figure from the time of Sulla and Marius. This is all the same people, same generation. Concurrently with the Social War came the Mithradatic War, which was called that because it involved King Mithradates VI of Pontus. Pontus is modern northeastern Turkey on the Black Sea. It controlled a lot of the Black Sea trade, so it was disproportionately wealthy. And this is 20 years after Jugurtha, and the social war is going on in the background, with the provinces are in revolt in Italy itself, all the local elites. And he didn't rely on money so much as things were so bad with Rome's internal divisions that he realized, I can take advantage of this chaos and these divisions of the social war to attack in the east. And really, the Romans had no armies to throw at him. They were fighting in Italy itself against the other. He wasn't formally allied with the local elites in Italy, but they happened to be fighting the Romans at the same time, enemy of my enemy. And he very cleverly, he played off the Optimates and Populares against each other. That when they actually did try to assemble an army, the Sulla and Marius started fighting over who would get to lead the army, because whoever goes east and defeats him gets all the plunder. That's a really big advantage, being put in charge of the army that'll defeat and sack Pontus. So Sulla was going to lead the army, and Marius was insulted, so he rose in revolt, and the civil war kicked off in earnest. And Sulla had to return to Rome to openly fight Marius. So he just had to quickly grant Pontus peace on generous terms and withdraw. So it's, oh, dragons are invincible, like how the Roman legions are invincible. Well, these guys ran circles around them, that Jugurtha used bribery. Mithradates played off the Optimates and Populares against each other, so they were too busy fighting to have forces to send to him. They only had like a legion or two to send at him, which he could deal with relatively well with his limited strength. So, just looking at Roman history, and this is the lives of one generation. If you look at the biography of Marius and Sulla, I'm going to link all this in the description, of the civil wars that ended the Republic round 1. This is before Caesar, he was round 2. That the freeholders are like a mishmash of the social war, which was widespread, of just all the local elites who realized the Romans aren't going to let us have power in the Senate, mixed with Jugurtha and a dash of Mithradates, that actively playing off, well, I'm guessing, like, maybe they'll bribe off the young dragons to fight the Sphinxes, or one general to fight the other ones, and then vice versa whenever anyone starts sending an army at them. So using money and diplomacy to play the internal factions against each other, much like Littlefinger in Westeros, of, well, we're the ones pushing the other factions into fighting each other as leverage rather than a direct confrontation. And the Valyrian Dragonlords, they can't understand that there are other forms of power than brute force. Which is interesting if you like all the intrigue-mongering and political double-dealing and not just giant battles. That can be very interesting. Now, this is from the description that I put out in the initial leak about Empire of Ash. This is the official way of phrasing it, that this story centers on the decline and fall of Valyria, a colonial empire which ruled half of the known world at its height. It reveals the social, economic, and political crises which tore apart the empire from within. It's not just, oh, we're fighting over love and honor and good and evil. There were social, economic, and political factors involved. And another emphasis on diversity and immigration and cultural identity of the freeholders going, the Dragonlords don't think of us as real Valyrians and are excluding us from the Senate, and we don't have real voting rights. And the economic pressures that this is also changing everything up. So, this is realistic. Most wars in human history weren't the eternal struggle between good and evil, life and death. They were fought over money and political crises and power struggles. So, like the A Song of Ice and Fire main series, a lot of thought went into world-building the Valyrian Freehold, how its economy realistically functions. Just looking at the series Bible, there was page after page of this and explaining why the wars that are tearing them apart are happening. Well, there's an economic basis of why is this faction powerful and this one isn't, and what are their strategic goals, and working out these economic factors that drove the war. Empire of Ash. Turmoil has engulfed the Valyrian Freehold. The taxation of trade routes to the outlying provinces is in dispute. Basically, the Freeholders in Star Wars terms are like the Separatist Alliance. All the great engines of commerce and local power barons and merchant guilds who realized the central government is weak and corrupt, let's form a secessionist movement to try to strike out on our own. And that is itself paralleling what happened to the Roman Republic. Oh, in the comments section, don't give me that, oh no, it was because of the dark side and the Sith. Come on. Citizenship test. What was the cause of the Clone War? Well, actually, there were numerous causes. Aside from the obvious schism between the light and dark sides of the Force, economic factors, both local and galactic, played a significant... Hey, just say the dark side. The dark side it is, sir. Just how many people rolled their eyes at that and didn't like the opening scrawl episode 1 trying to explain this is why these factions are fighting each other. Realistically, it's rooted in, well, like Rome, their economy is in decline, and other various factors. Just, oh, that's all the politics stuff. Give me the eternal struggle of good versus evil and the light and dark sides. That isn't realistic. Realistic wars are rooted in the world building of real politic and economics. I live for that stuff. I'm a historian. So, in real-life history, how do great empires and large-scale democracies decline? They said when they were writing the prequel trilogy, Lucas said I was looking through how this is how most empires decline, how most democracies decline. Always from within. Often because the ruling class, political elites, establishment politicians stop caring about the general welfare and gradually get corrupt, and more concerned with internal rivalries with other politicians over power and wealth. At least 2 factions of politicians, sometimes more than 2 if they have more political parties, but the political parties' entrenched bureaucrats are fighting each other over money, and they have no concern for the state as a whole or the people. And these corrupt elites are not usually met with a serious challenge by the common people. I mean, that has never happened. Slave uprisings, peasant rebellions, they rarely succeed, historically, due to a simple lack of resources needed to directly challenge the powerful. That you just don't have the resource base to do that. Like, oh, Les Miserables, we're going to have a spontaneous revolt in the streets. The rebellion failed in Les Miserables. They didn't have armies and that many guns. What happens is the mid-level power elites turn on the ruling class, often channeling popular discontent. The wealthy merchants and industrialists who actually have just... This isn't left or right, it's just on a basis of practicality, realistically, who physically has the resources to hire armies and build weapons? Well, the industrialists. someone who can actually manufacture things, or sometimes powerful local governors, regional government, religious leaders occasionally, sometimes even labor unions because they can physically organize large numbers of people, but the rich and powerful, or the local elites, not just some spontaneous revolution in the streets. That's crazy. That's never happened. Example, the American War of Independence against Britain. There weren't just spontaneously farmers shooting at redcoats. That the leaders of the rebellion were the local governments of the 13 colonies, organized and said, we're going to make our own breakaway government. That simply because they have the resources and organizational capacity to lead. That these were men who were in the local assembly of Virginia or Boston or shipping companies. And that's what was happening when Rome fell, that there were regions of local elites breaking away, trying to strike out on their own, more so than just spontaneous slave revolts. Like I said, Valyria is like ancient Rome with dragons. And therefore the freeholders are like the local elites in the provinces. Wealthy, but not ethnically Roman, or not high-ranking Roman nobles. They're not in the Senate. They're below Senate level. And Rome has been frequently used as an analog in many sci-fi and fantasy empires, both in space and medieval fantasy. So, in other series, compare the Freeholders as similar to the Separatist Alliance in Star Wars. Or I think a better fit would be, if you've read it, the Independent Traitors in Asimov's Foundation series, which actually Star Wars was heavily inspired by Asimov's Foundation series, and Asimov did some cribbing from Gibbon. Gibbon was a Roman historian, so Star Wars was copying Asimov, who's copying Rome, and Star Wars is also directly inspired by Rome. So this is just the Rome example reverberating through the ages, because it's what happens. It's a stereotype for a reason. This is how empires fall. That in Star Wars, the Separatists hoarded the great engines of commerce. You get the major industrialists and conglomerates who actually have the resources to support armies. And they think the republishment establishment bureaucrats are corrupt, so their answer is to side with all the corrupt billionaires to overthrow them. But Asimov, Foundation series, basically, if you haven't read it, it would take a long time to explain. The Galactic Empire, its capital is at the center of the galaxy at Trantor, and the Galactic Empire is declining from lack of internal inertia, so this scientist, Harry Seldon, realizes we'll build these two core foundations, these scientist sanctuaries from which to rebuild the Empire. And he'll build two foundations at opposite ends of the galaxy. One is at Terminus on one end, and the other one is on the other side of the galaxy somewhere at Star's End. And gradually Terminus starts building its own empire, even as the other empire falls apart. And by 300 years or so later, the problem is Terminus and the Foundation are running into the same problems the Empire had, that all of the wealthy merchant princes on the frontiers are getting excluded from the power base on the capital planet, which is getting really corrupt. So the Independent Traitors form as a faction, and on wealthy fringe worlds like Haven. And in the second novel, Foundation and Empire, the Independent Traitors try to revolt against the central government. And this is a Seldon crisis. But, you know, for one of the great classics of science fiction, if you haven't read Foundation Trilogy yet, just go ahead and read it. Everything is in there. It's the fall of the Roman Empire in space. If you know what I'm talking about, the Freeholders are the Independent Traitors from the Foundation series. And if you haven't read that, they're like the Separatist Alliance from Star Wars. What I'm trying to stress here is there are heroes and villains on both sides, that this isn't a simple case of good and evil, black and white. For even with the Separatist Alliance, after Episode 3 ended with the rise of the Empire, I've seen a lot of people in fandom trying to whitewash the Separatists as the real heroes. And I admit it makes it morally complex. They weren't bland villains, but they sided with corrupt billionaires and conglomerates out of necessity. That's purely out of self-interest. We need their industrial capacity to survive. And some of them honestly believe in what they're doing. That when you see the do-nothing separatist parliament in the cartoons and spin-offs, there are some people who aren't just greedy billionaires, but who honestly believe the Republic isn't serving our interests. And that makes it complex, but that doesn't mean they were objectively good. It means it was a spectrum of good and evil characters. Similarly, the Republic had truly declined by Episode 1 when they couldn't handle the Naboo crisis. They had truly declined into an inept, graft-filled bureaucracy with many corrupt politicians. And even then, those trying to fix it in Episodes 2 and 3 were in turn divided between proto-fascists militarizing into the Empire like Tarkin, and a few idealists like Padme, Organa, Mon Mothma, who did want to defend and reform the Republic without turning it into this fascist police state. So there's a spectrum of good and bad characters on both sides. What we're trying to build up to is that this is gray versus gray morality, which I love. Like A Song of Ice and Fire, it makes it more complex. This is realistic political conflict in which there are no clear heroes or villains. Rather, factions and characters who act out of their own self-interest, with mixed examples in each. So this is not an epic battle of good and evil, life and death, stock heroes versus zombies and ice demons. I can't really get into that. We're going to have a Long Night prequel fighting zombies. It's been done, and it's simplistic. The reason I'm giving all this setup is a few people I've started explaining this to jumped to the conclusion that the conservative Sphinx faction are the, quote, villains, and that the Freeholders are the, quote, heroes, the plucky freedom fighters standing up to Valyrian tyranny. No. They're all politicians. The Freeholders don't want to destroy the Freehold. They're just yet another group fighting for a share in its power. If you thought, this is simplistic, that the multicultural alliance of local elites are the good guys, here's a thought. All three of these factions practice slavery, including the Freeholders. I mean, they're wealthy merchants. And Valyria's economy is heavily based on slavery. I mean, directly or indirectly, they depend on it, and they have no intention of stopping it. So I'm trying to use these examples like from Star Wars, where they're not these pure good guys, nor are they villains. Well, there's some who I imagine, with the way they described it, is some of them are idealistically, we need to reform Valyria, and we want voting rights, and we're being excluded from that. And a lot of them are just regional merchant barons, merchant princes who want to buy the government. And it's a mix of both, and I think it makes it more interesting that way. That similarly, when the Sphinxes were described to me, if you haven't watched a video on that, please check that out, that, the Sphinxes seem kind of almost honorable, and, they're elitists, but they're not these stock villains, and they actually, you can see why people would support them, that they're not evil as such. So there's good and bad factors to all three factions, which I think is really exciting for this as a story. Now, just to be clear, this is all my extrapolation from my knowledge of the A Song of Ice and Fire books and of Roman history. I was told, they're the local elites and wealthy merchants and rich bankers. And I just put together, this is exactly what Rome did, and putting together that Valyria is like Rome. So I'm not giving out super spoilers. I'm not, you made all this up. I'm saying, I'm giving you context. I said at the beginning, I'm giving you context that put two and two together. These guys are basically like what happened to Rome. And the exact phrasing that I was given, looking at my notes, was areas within the Freehold, but outside Valyria. That is, Valyria the city. You know, like Volantis or Marine. It's part of the Freehold, but Valyria is specifically the volcanoes and old Valyria the city. So, outer provinces versus capital, and they started explaining, well, they're the local elites and wealthy local merchants. They're the Separatist Alliance. They're the independent traders from Asimov. So as I'm winding this video down, a few quick points. This video is part 1, then we'll go into part 2 on the Freeholders. First, I showed you the title page on this and the symbol I'm using for them. To be clear, I have no idea what the faction symbol of the Freeholders is. There's a page in the series Bible giving an overview of each faction with artwork, and because someone was just holding it up to the camera, showing it to me in a 2-hour video chat, I got a fairly good look at the first two. I'm pretty confident that's what the first two were, but not the Freeholders. And it's not even that I don't remember it, it's just an hour later I went, damn it, I didn't get a good look at their symbol, and I didn't think to ask, oh, would you please focus more on that concept art there? So I kept thinking they'd show me in a minute, and then they were done. So I knew 2 symbols. I managed to recreate the Sphinx symbol reasonably well from a heraldry database I looked at, but the Freeholders have a symbol, but I couldn't see it clearly. It was blurry. So, I used symbols in the other 2 videos. This is just a placeholder symbol I threw together for, these video purposes. And I figured, I'll cobble something together. So this is displaying a photo of a real Roman coin that I just grabbed off Wikipedia. It felt appropriate to use money as their symbol, like the Iron Bank or something. So that's a placeholder symbol. I don't know what their real artwork is. And some people go, oh, I'm making all of this up. If I was making this up, I would have made up a symbol for them and said this is real, not, embarrassingly, it was too blurry to see what their symbol was. So, it'll be fun if it's a coin, but I'm being honest with you, letting you know this is, a leak report. Some of it's a bit sketchy. However, I did make sure to check the spelling with my source, because I wanted to get this right. I made them slow down and asked them to specify and confirm. It's very clearly, I confirm this 100%, the faction name is officially Freeholders. 2 separate words, capital F, capital H. Even though Freehold is spelled as one word in Valyrian Freehold, just because. And then even Martin, in his other thing on, the Freeholders, sometimes he uses 2 words. Officially, from the series Bible, their name is Freeholders, 2 words. And lastly, this is a big point that we've been discussing among the fandom on Twitter and in the YouTube comments, and there really isn't a right answer. I didn't realize this, but it turns out Freeholders doesn't really translate well into other languages. There's this good Italian channel that, by Khalil, which was reporting on Empire Vash in Italian, and pointed out this doesn't directly translate, so I don't know if there really is one good answer to this. So I want you guys to help me out in the comment section for this video. How do you think we should translate Freeholders into non-English languages? That it's short for free landholders. It literally, free land owners. From Freehold of Valyria, Valyrian Freehold. All freeborn landowners can vote. And as it says in the books, Book 5, Volantis is a freehold like Valyria of old. All freeborn landholders share the rule. Even women are allowed to vote. So if you have a copy of Book 5 in a non-English language, please check out how your version translates this paragraph. It's in the chapter titled The Merchant's Man, Book 5. That when they say freeborn landholders, but even then the translator for that specific book might have just been guessing, and we might need to use a better one. And I was asking around, I don't speak this many languages, I know French and Latin, that several non-English translations of Valyrian Freehold aren't literal, or use substitutions that really lose that meaning of free landhold. The official German translation of Freehold of Valyria is Freistaat, literally Free State of Valyria, which it doesn't include that sense of land ownership. In Portuguese, they just use dominio, literally domain of Valyria. It loses that sense of landhold. So translations will probably lose some of the original meaning no matter what they do. But the idea is the name itself is supposed to kind of feel outdated. That sense that might be lost in translation, that it's archaic and inaccurate. Think about it, that reflecting how the ancient Valyrian Dragonlord aristocracy who invented these categories like 5,000 years ago only thought of making money from owning land, not from commerce or lending money at interest. Many of the free landholders in the story are actually rich bankers or merchant guilds and trade cartels. I mean, I guess they nominally own some land, like they own their warehouse, they own a dock and a shipping wharf, but their wealth didn't come from land owning, it came from money lending and trade. So the name itself is a little outdated, and I fear translations wouldn't really get that. So I've been discussing this online with fans who were excited about Empire of Ash, of just how would you translate Freeholder, and some that were suggested to me, but I don't know how good they might be. I don't know these languages well enough to really get a feel for it. Are German, a closer translation would be Freer Landbesitzer, free landowners. Portuguese, it sounds too literal though, Proprietario de terras livre. Spanish, Proprietario de la tierra libre. Polish, I'm purely guessing based on what the Separatist Alliance is called, Sojusz Handlowa. Would that be a good term for these guys? And for Italian, I suggested to someone, call them the Alliance of Merchants, because that's kind of what the Trade Federation is called in Star Wars. That would be La Alianza de Mercante, I think. That basically they're magisters, like Illyria Mapatis of Pentos in A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, for like the dozen or more languages these books have been translated into, I don't know what everyone... They don't all translate magister. Like the German version said, they just say magister as a direct loan word. They didn't try to make a German version of it. So whatever, if they have a local version of magister or banker in the version you guys use, maybe. So, how would we translate this? No right answer now, but hey, we're sitting around for months with nothing else to do, and as opposed to, wow, I'm not really liking the sound of that other prequel, I'm excited about this, and I think it generates fandom discussion of, well, how would we translate Freeholder into other languages? It's literally short for free landowner. How would you say that? Bourgeoisie, burgher, landed gentry, magister. If all else fails, to get that sense of they're the rich merchants more than landed lords. They're not lords, hereditary lords. If all else fails, I recommend literally translating Alliance of Merchants, or the Merchants Alliance, because that gets a better sense of what they really are than free landowners, because they're bankers and shipping trade cartels. So please help out with that in the comments section below. And this is more of a lead-in to the next video on geography, that are there trade cartels and merchant guilds in the A Song of Ice and Fire novels, or is this prequel just making that up? Yeah, there are. I mean, they're not prominent, but they've been mentioned as existing. In A Song of Ice and Fire, each of the 9 free cities has its own bank, but Westeros has none. They're too agrarian. They're not as urbanized as the free cities. And merchant guilds are mentioned in passing, but due to the agrarian society in Westeros, they're not prominent in the narrative compared to in the free cities. When characters go there, you hear about them a little more. But even in Westeros, in King's Landing at least, Feast for Crows, Cersei Chapter 5, Cersei took her midday meal with members of the merchant guilds and listened to them complain. So there are merchant guilds in the background. I'm not going to read off this whole thing, that there's this whole section of the second Daenerys chapter in A Dance with Dragons where they're talking about craftsmen's guilds and merchant guilds in Marine, and the old ones are annoyed that the slaves she freed are now calling themselves journeymen and masters, and she has to negotiate with them. Well, okay, the slaves do need to join but you have to be willing to admit them if you want to retain the right to say who gets to be a journeyman or a master. So there's trade guilds in King's Landing, in Volantis, in Marine, that these are part of their world. And passing mention was indeed made of a, quote, trade cartel, using the word cartel as an organization, though not focused on that much in A Song of Ice and Fire. In the first book, when Eddard is at the small council meeting, they explain the crown is more than 6 million gold pieces in debt. The Lannisters are the biggest part of it, but we have also borrowed from Lord Tyrell, the Iron Bank of Bravos, and several Tiroshi trading cartels. And of late have had to turn to the faith in the High Septon. So, yeah, when you think the Freeholders are this alliance of various local elites and bankers and trade cartels, we already knew those existed in their world. Like I said, as in A Song of Ice and Fire, a lot of thought went into world-building the Valyrian Freehold. I mean, all of it. How its economy realistically functions. Which regions produce which things that give them strategic value in war, or would make certain merchants powerful money barons. So I honestly thought, going into the video chat where this was leaked to me, I asked them, so are they going to be based in Volantis or perhaps Marine? That I thought, they'll use this as an opportunity to work in a location the TV audience is already familiar with. And they looked at me and went, actually, they're based in Sothorios. They're all over the Freehold, but their stronghold is in Sothorios. And I said, Sothorios? And that's exciting. And they went, well, you see, turns out Sothorios is the richest province. It's the richest colony. And I did a double take. Went, really? That it's not just, it's this tiny little Roman North Africa province. No, they're the power brokers now. They're the wealthiest province. The way that Constantinople or Carthage would be in Rome, that they dominate trade to the east. So when they explained it, they went in more detail in that. I went, yeah, as a book reader and a book snob who's really strict about these things, it entirely makes sense that Sothorios would be the wealthiest province. So I'm going to cover that more in part 2 of this video series of why are they physically in Sothorios as their headquarters and their stronghold. They're all over, but that's the main physical location that the TV series will explore, is Sothorios as the province that's revolting against Valyria.